This video is brought to you by BetterHelp. Okay, so every so often an article actually sustains my attention among my usual 37 or so open tabs. And recently, it was James Gregg's piece, Everyone Needs to Grow Up. We have a link in the description, which explores the infantilization of American culture. It got us talking, and not just because we felt called out. We wondered, has culture become childish? Are we all babies now? And if so, what are the implications of an increasingly infantilized society? So pop in your pacifier and join us for this Wisecrack Edition on the babyfication of culture. But before we get into it, we want to thank this video sponsor, BetterHelp. Now, if you've experienced anxiety or depression, or generally just felt overwhelmed, BetterHelp is a resource that can help you feel better. And guys, you've heard me talk about this before, but I'm someone who goes to therapy. It's been really, really important for dealing with a lot of stuff, and I really can't recommend it enough. Now, BetterHelp's network of more than 20,000 therapists are ready to listen to and help you. Now, after you take a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a therapist whose expertise fits your unique needs. And thanks to BetterHelp's remote model, you can work with a therapist whose skills might not otherwise be available in your area. Now, you can message them at any time and you'll receive timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule your choice of secure phone or video sessions to receive counseling in real time. And in the event that you and your therapist aren't a perfect match, you can easily switch to a new one for no additional charge. And again, as someone who's suffered for much of my life with depression, getting to talk to a therapist has been really great. One thing I really like about it is when you first start going to therapy, you say stuff and you feel like I'm a crazy, bad, weird person. And then this specialist and expert's like, oh no, man, that's normal. People go through that. And you feel like, oh, I can deal with this. So that's a cool thing. So join the more than 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/wisecrack, or just click the link in the video description. When you do, you'll get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/wisecrack. Okay, now let's get back to the show. Now, to stay in our lane, we're going to focus on what this looks like right here in the US of A. But for our international friends, let us know in the comments if and or how the babyfication of culture shows up in your country. Or are you just adults? Okay, let's get into it. Now, calling American culture immature is nothing new. In 1946, French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss noted that American culture was charmingly infantile, citing its fixation on things like baseball, toy-like cars, and hobbies. But if you had to identify who set up 30-year-olds to argue about whether they're a Gryffindor or a Ravenclaw, you can, as always, blame the boomers. Shout it out in the comments if you thought I was about to say blame Ronald Reagan. While pockets of the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945, reveled in a kind of permanent adolescence by becoming beat poets, or like Hugh Hefner, the vast majority just lived vicariously through their more out-there brethren. In contrast, according to writer Kurt Anderson, the boomers were the first generation en masse to refuse to relinquish the perquisites, i.e. privileges, of youth as they aged, and thus ushered in a new national fantasy of permanent youthfulness. The groundwork for this was laid when teenagers became the focus of pop culture in the 50s, and then throughout the 60s with the popularization of the idea of the inner child and widespread suspicion of everyone over 30.
We're gonna make 30 a mandatory retirement age, and we're gonna set up rehabilitation camps, mercy centers in every state of the union.
But as boomers aged out of literal youth, they began to embrace figurative youth. While their elders blamed the boomers' disruption of normative adulthood on their character shortcomings, Frankfurt School scholars, such as Herbert Marcuse and Erich Fromm, would disagree. In their view, entire societies can experience arrested development thanks to social engineering. Indeed, the babyfication of boomers was largely facilitated by the mass media, and specifically advertising. As Joseph Epstein writes, the whole sweep of advertising culture since soon after World War II has been continuously to lower the criteria of youthfulness while extending the possibility for seeming youthful to older and older people. While boomers rebelled against consumer society in the 60s, that rebellion was, according to Gary Cross, steeped in a profound individualism, which, as the collectivism of the counterculture began to fade, ironically led hippies back to the consumerism they were ostensibly rebelling against. Cross goes on to say advertisers transformed them into what he calls the Pepsi generation. Consumerism gave boomers a safe space to revel in their lost youth and avoid aging via liberation marketing, which posited the right consumer goods as offering freedom from conformity. As Cross notes, advertising and consumer culture more broadly turned youthful rebellion into a commodity that wouldn't change even as boomers aged. Throughout the 70s and 80s, nostalgia became increasingly intertwined with pop culture, as boomers were encouraged to relive their childhoods through films, albums, and music videos. By the 80s and 90s, the culture of adult childishness was mainstream, as adults became a huge audience for video games, comic books, and fantasy sports, as well as collectors of everything from model railroads to baseball cards to toys to vintage beer cans. Now, as a team that just fucking loves a good fruit roll-up, we're the last people to knock the consumption of childish things. But it's worth noting two other trends that occurred over the same period. First, the once sober topic of politics began to resemble popular entertainment. As JFK, the first TV president, was elected, writer Norman Mailer speculated that America's politics would now be also America's favorite movie, America's first soap opera, America's bestseller. Fittingly, by 1980, a B-movie star was elected president, and by the early 90s, Clinton was winning over voters with his sweet sax style and telling teens on MTV about his underwear.
Usually briefs.
Secondly, as Anderson notes, the 80s and 90s were a time of extreme optimism and quasi-religious devotion to the free market, as financialization took over the economy. Writer Nick Paumgarten argues that during this time, Wall Street honed the art of creating and selling financial products with an increasingly tenuous connection to reality, based largely on what he calls magical thinking. Anderson calls this Fantasyland economics, which, given its complete detachment from actual value, he believes inevitably contributed to the wild speculation and risk-taking that led to the 2008 financial collapse. In other words, it wasn't just hobbies that got childish. It was also politics, economics, and marketing. Now, the boomers' permanent nostalgia seemingly pissed off their first batch of kids who grew up as the small contingent of Gen X. That generation was, according to writer Carl Wilson, united by our dislike of nostalgia and our irritation whenever our barely formed narratives were appropriated and marketed back at us. But what about today? Babyfication and its wistful twin nostalgia aren't mere features of millennial culture, but the very water we're swimming in. From superhero movies and reboots dominating entertainment to adult coloring books, from adult Disney communities to YA novels, from Pokemon Go to LARPing, to spending hours watching cat videos. We call women girls, we watch man children on TV, and we dress like we did as teens. And I'm just glad that I wore a shirt with buttons today because normally I dress like a kid. And once we filmed a video with Devin from Legal Eagle, and our then producer laughed, and I said, "What are you laughing at?" And he said, "It looks like an 8th grader sitting next to a professional lawyer." I was the 8th grader in that one. Even the most popular aspects of the millennial design aesthetic evoke a childlike playfulness. Soft pinks, rounded edges, boob-shaped vases, and fun topography urging us to work hard and be nice to people. Writer and editor Deborah Needleman argues that aesthetically, everything now just seems saccharine. And the truth is, babyfying adults is profitable. And to be clear, when we say babyfying adults is profitable, we don't mean that if there was a machine that could turn adults back into babies, that selling those babies who were adults would be profitable. It might be, but we're talking about like the marketing mechanisms, right? So it's more just a metaphor. In the age of global capitalism, the youth economy first forged for the boomers has now become the entire economy. As author Benjamin Barber writes, it is an ethos of induced childishness, an infantilization that is closely tied to the demands of consumer capitalism in a global market economy. By centering culture around the young, you create lifelong consumers who will continue to respond to the same inputs they grew up seeing. As scholar Keith Hayward writes, major advertising campaigns unashamedly align their products with childhood nostalgia, while cartoon tropes are now a staple theme of adult campaigns, used to sell everything from caffeinated energy drinks to banking services. At the same time, according to sociologist Simon Gottschalk, new technology further encourages childish emotions, like the desire for instant gratification. He writes, our daily interactions with smartphones and social media are so pleasurable precisely because they normalize and gratify infantile dispositions. Even if we're not forking out $40 to visit the Museum of Ice Cream, we're all metaphorically swimming in a big pool of rainbow sprinkles. In her essay, The Cuteness of the Avant-Garde, scholar Sian Nai defies cuteness as an aesthetic of powerlessness, a way to magnify the impotence of an object or piece of art until it begins to look silly. In that way, the least empowered generation's love for all things cute begins to make a lot of sense. Note, cuteness is seen in a very different incarnation in Japanese kawaii aesthetic and culture, but that's outside our purview for today. But hey, if you're in Japan, let us know what that's like in the comments. Viewed in the context of powerlessness, the appeal of youthful comforts seems reasonable. Millennials exist in a state of social, economic, cultural insecurity that reflects a childlike psychological state. In fact, Clark University psychologist Jeffrey Jensen Arnett identified what he considered to be a new life stage, which he called emerging adulthood. The era encompasses roughly ages 18 to 29 and is characterized by things like identity exploration, personal instability, self-focus, a feeling of being in between, and a sense of possibilities. It's easy to see emerging adulthood as a choice, and many a think piece about millennials wasting their money on avocado toast has. But in reality, this stage is largely forced upon millennials, who the Washington Post called the unluckiest generation in U.S. history. Keenan Fikri, the director for research at the Economic Innovation Group, adds that, in a way, millennials are part of a vast and accidental social experiment. We've never launched an entire generation with so much financial baggage. As Charlotte Cowles notes in the New York Times, millennials were once considered harbingers of economic progress and promise. But today, she says, we lag behind in the financial and familial progress of our parents. And the stats bear this out. People born in the 80s, who were especially kneecapped by the Great Recession, have the highest debt-to-income ratio and are 11% behind wealth expectations. At the same time, the average millennial earns 20% less than boomers at the same stage of their career. I can't compare because there weren't boomers that were YouTube hosts back in the day. So I guess I'm forging a new path that one day my child can compare themselves to when they say, "Dad, how much did you make when you were a YouTube host?" And I tell them, and they're like, "I make less than that." And I'm like, "How do you live?" And they're like, "I don't." Monetary stress, ranging from debt to inflation to the sky-high housing market, is a big reason that so many millennials are putting off usual benchmarks of maturation, like marriage or having children or buying a house or even just a nice suit. And things aren't much better off for our coming-of-age Gen Z counterparts, nearly 75% of whom can't pay their bills on time and who may be on the next impoverished adult to adult baby pipeline. Is it any wonder then that in the face of these challenges, young and increasingly less young adults take comfort in painting our houses like nurseries despite not being able to afford kids, or living on a comfortable entertainment diet of Marvel and Star Wars content? And for that matter, what's wrong with being in touch with our inner child? Children are fun, creative, and often a better hang than adults. Well, according to Barber, the consumer capitalist infantilization that's going on does not represent a countercultural campaign to recognize those features of childhood that might be sources of virtue: innocence, authenticity, creativity, spontaneity, and playfulness. On the contrary, it is a campaign to repress those features of childhood in favor of others that make adults vulnerable, manipulable, impulsive, and irrational. The resulting directive impulsivity being encouraged by the culture industry, he argues, is not in the service of wide-eyed, childlike creativity or discovery. It's in the service of us buying more shit. But this all has implications beyond our viewing or spending habits. Just as boomers' chosen immaturity and love of nostalgia was accompanied by real political and economic implications, most of which we can say were not great, millennial nostalgia is being accompanied by the rise of infantilized soft news, according to Hayward, meaning media which peddles in sound bites and memes for audiences raised on digital instantaneity. At the same time, we've seen the erosion of complexity and the dumbing down of debate across media and politics, according to Hayward. Childish thinking seems to dominate the conversation, as catch-all terms like critical race theory or cancel culture are lobbed like playground accusations. That's despite the fact they've become all but meaningless, as we learned when one anti-woke activist failed to define the term woke, despite having written a whole book about the concept.
Woke is sort of the idea that
If we now have childlike attention spans by design, we also get the discourse to match it. The French psychoanalyst Felix Guattari warned about the hazard of a culture of infantilization back in the 80s. Now, he argued that cultural infantilization represented a merging together of childhood and adulthood in a kind of permanent combination of infancy and teenage adolescence, one largely characterized by homogeneity. I mean, think about it. Aren't all babies basically alike? A scholar, Don Kay, summarizes, the infantilized subject is kept distracted from what Guattari calls the mysteries of life and death. Rather than facing up to their limited time on Earth, infantilized subjects flee into the eternity of the moment by means of mass media and television. Think binge watching. As a result, we live in a collective fantasy where we all share what Guattari calls an equalized subjectivity, with standardized fantasies and massive consumption of infantilizing reassurances. But despite our identical fantasies, he argues infantilization atomizes us due to its walling up of the ego, defined by an inward focus on our own fixed being and self-understanding. In that state, the individual shields itself from being truly affected by its surroundings. This has real-world consequences. Keege goes on to say that this denial of subjectivity's dependence on exteriority also manifests itself as the inability to face up to the exploitation of the earth. Waste, pollution, and extinction are kept at a distance. Again, this is due both to an unwillingness of the infantilized subject to face the far-reaching consequences of its mode of living, and to the efforts of multinationals to conceal the death and destruction caused by consumerist capitalism. In other words, if we're being treated like atomized babies, we can do about as much about climate change as the average toddler. The infantilized subject is a pliable political subject, unlikely to agitate for anything besides a clean diaper. Does this mean you have to burn your adult coloring book or never watch a superhero film again? No, of course not. But it does mean that it's probably a good idea to try to be aware of when you're being treated like a child, whether by a news anchor, a politician, or a persuasive commercial. And then, of course, to think for a second, with your big kid brain, about why you're being treated like a child and who benefits from it. But what do you all think? Is it actually pretty fun to live the Peter Pan lifestyle for as long as possible? Doesn't being an adult kind of suck anyways? Or should we be striving for a world that finally lets us grow up? Let us know in the comments. Special shout out to all of our patrons who we think of as our own little group of lost boys, girls, whatever you identify as, who support us and get to stay young forever on our Discord server while they watch our videos early with no ads and get extra audio and video content. If you too want to be a Wisecrack kid, consider joining our Patreon. There's a link in the description. But thank you so much to all of you for hanging out, and thank you for engaging in conversations and topics on this channel that I think are not babyfied, where we try to talk about things in a complex way. Even when you don't agree with us, it means a lot that you're here and engaging in that conversation. Thanks for letting us keep that going. And thank you to everyone who likes, clicks, subscribes, comments, feeds the algorithm. It means a lot to us. But in the meantime, I don't know, grow up, and we'll see you later.